The office of the President of the United States of America is up there with the most powerful and single-minded positions in the world, yet the 45 men who have held that office have entirely different stories. Starting off with George Washington, the first ever president of the United States who sat in office from 1789 to 1797. He was a young man who didn't grow up wealthy, had to educate himself from the age of 15 because his family couldn't afford formal education, but ended up being unanimously elected into the office twice. Talk about setting the precedent for the American dream. His time in office was earmarked by his bravery in the face of battle, which saved the American Revolution twice, his overall dedication to leadership, and his support in founding the first bank of the United States. Overall, a pretty impressive dude, but the same can't be said for his successor, John Adams. All this guy needed was one 4-year term to put up the Alien Act, which today would be considered an anti-immigration law, the Sedition Act, which stands against every basic human rights of expression or criticism of government, and the XYZ affair, which eventually led to the Quasi-War. Adams wasn't a fan favorite, but thankfully, he was succeeded by Thomas Jefferson, who's up there with the best of the bunch. Authoring the Declaration of Independence, famously insisting that all men are created equal, even though he was a slave master, slashing the national debt by a third, limiting the size of the military, and acquiring the Louisiana Territory, all within 8 years. Definitely a top 5 US president, if you ask us. Next was James Madison, another two-termer who, although wasn't as busy as Jefferson, is regarded fondly by the history books for his strong moral authority and for having the bravery to not only declare war against Great Britain in 1812, but also come out of it in good condition. He was not a rock star, but Madison got the job done, which is what makes him so similar to his namesake, James Monroe, who sat in office after him. Monroe considered himself a Democratic Republican. Most of his tenure was considered the era of good feelings that further established the United States' dominance in the Western Hemisphere. He had stellar international relations skills, but is remembered by most financialists for overseeing the first widespread and durable financial crisis in the nation's history. His successor, John Quincy Adams, was a man who would be remembered more fondly for opposing slavery if he had been in power 2 centuries later than he was. When his term ended in 1829, Andrew Jackson took over and served for 8 years, not because he was particularly special, but because he was a man of the people who could draw crowds, and he was openly responsible for the death of thousands of Native Americans. Up next was Martin Van Buren, another Democrat whose major highlights was legalizing divorce and failing to end the Panic of 1837, resulting in longer years of economic downturn. He was followed by William Henry Harrison, who ended up having the shortest term as US president when he died of pneumonia just 31 days after his inauguration. Sad, and even more disappointing when you found out that his successor was John Tyler, a staunch Democrat who fathered at least 15 children but couldn't get the Congress to support his veto of legislation. After Tyler's 4 years in office came the 11th president of the US, James K. Polk, a protege of Andrew Jackson, who instigated and eventually won the Mexican-American War, acquired more than 800,000 square miles of western land, but had no interest in seeking a second term. From Polk's war arose a national hero by the name of Zachary Taylor, who became the 12th president despite having little or no political background. Taylor died only 16 months into his tenure, but not before he strongly opposed slavery while himself benefiting heavily from it. It's no surprise the president who followed, Millard Fillmore, spent his time in office focusing majorly on just slavery by seeing to the Compromise of 1850 and single-handedly pushing the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. After him came Franklin Pierce, another Democrat hardly remembered by history except for making policies and moves that put the nation on the path to civil war, and unsuccessfully trying to acquire Cuba and Nicaragua. If Pierce gathered the splinter for the fires of the Civil War, his successor, James Buchanan, lit the fire. From leading the country into the financial crisis of 1857 to failing to understand the nation's divisions over slavery, Buchanan's 4 years in office puts him on every historian's 5 worst presidents list. But you know what they say, it's darkest before the dawn, and that turned out to be the case for American politics when Abe Lincoln was sworn into office in 1861. Between then and 1865, the list of commendable actions and inactions Lincoln performed as the first Republican president would probably need an entire video. Let's keep it as him leading the country through the Civil War better than any other person could have, and signing the Emancipation Proclamation to free slaves in 1863. Unfortunately, he was infamously assassinated at a movie theater, and since the show must go on, Andrew Johnson was elected and power returned to the Democrats. And guess what? Johnson turned out to be perhaps the only president publicly regarded to be worse than Buchanan. He was just 1 vote shy of being impeached from office midway through the term. So when that ended, the Republicans took over again with Ulysses S. Grant as the main man. Unfortunately, he was a far cry from his political predecessor, Lincoln. Sure, he led the North to victory in the Civil War and was a strong advocate for civil rights during his day, but Grant's terrible administrative skills, corruption scandals, and sending the country into another financial crisis didn't do his rep much good. Similar patterns spilled into Rutherford B. Hayes' administration, although that would be overshadowed by the seemingly noble Civil Rights Act of 1875 and Jim Crow laws out in place by the 19th President of the United States. After him came James A. Garfield, another Republican who was shot twice just months into his term and eventually died 2 months later from the resulting injuries. Garfield isn't remembered for much, but he did give this interesting quote that can still be a topic of conversation today. I mean to make myself a man, and if I succeed in that, I shall succeed in everything else. Chester A. Arthur stepped in to complete Garfield's term and actually made steps toward stopping political corruption, like signing the Pendleton Act of 1883 to establish merit-based hiring in the federal government and end nepotism. Pretty sure he'd be disappointed to find out not much has changed in that light. After him came Grover Cleveland, who was a true believer in equality and helping the less privileged. A Democrat who actually vetoed a bill to give government money to veterans, drought stricken farmers, and people with disabilities, and even proposed a lower tariff to Congress to bring lower prices to consumers. Impressive acts of nobility, but it cost his party the next election. The Republicans took over again when Benjamin Harris came into office in 1889, but after the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890, which harmed American exports and brought more economic troubles to farmers, leading to the Panic of 1893 and eventually the depreciation of silver, the American society decided to bring back the nobleman. Yup, Grover Cleveland returned for a second term. His second term was less eventful and majorly featured him exploring the depths of his anti-imperialist notions. Once again, the American populace were in disagreement with the notions of the elected president, so power once again returned to the Republicans. An outspoken imperialist in William McKinley was sworn in, but very little changed. He did implement the Gold Standard Act of 1900, which provided stability to the financial system and reassured foreign investors, and also saw the annexation of Hawaii, so we have him to thank for the global dream vacation spot being made part of the US. McKinley was eventually assassinated by a deranged anarchist toward the end of his first term. Theodore Roosevelt was elected at age 42, making him the youngest president in the nation's history, and things were looking up again. Another top 5 presidential pick for historians, Roosevelt's energy and seemingly youthful enthusiasm inspired many progressive reforms by Congress and development of a strong foreign policy. After Roosevelt's 8 years in office, William Howard Taft became president, and although his election was sided by his relationship with Roosevelt, most of his policies were the exact opposite of his predecessors. He focused on East Asian more than European affairs and sided more with the Republican Party's conservative wing, but nothing too drastic since he'd later become the Chief Justice of the United States a few years later. Next came Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat who, all things considered, did a good job leading the country through the entirety of World War I, signed the 18th and 19th Amendments, and moved many pieces of important legislation through Congress. He was succeeded by the soft president, Warren G. Harding, a decent administration highlighted by economic boost and the growth of automotive and aviation industries, but marred by corruption like the infamous Teapot Dome scandal. Harding died in office 2 years in. The rather underwhelming Calvin Coolidge completed his predecessor's term and was elected in for another 4 years. Republican, responsible for the Capper-Volstead Act, terrible crisis leadership skills, couldn't care less about equality and justice, and he also refused to use the country's economic boom to help struggling farmers and other menial workers. A poor administration overall, which was succeeded by an even worse one. Herbert Hoover, the president who took America into the Great Depression. After a dark few years, Franklin D. Roosevelt came in to save the day, and that he did quite remarkably. His administration brought relief from the Depression, multiple financial and social reforms were put in place, and he guided the United States through the majority of World War II. To summarize, his tenure was so good, he became the first and only president to serve 4 terms. Harry Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower both had similarly satisfactory tenures in office, serving 2 terms each. The former seeing to the end of World War II in the Pacific and the signing of the Charter of the United Nations, while the latter, being a celebrated commander in World War II, helped navigate the onset of the Cold War. If there was ever a three-peat of elected presidents, it would be Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower. John F. Kennedy definitely could have made it a four-peat with his revolutionary ideas and strategies like the Peace Corps, handling the Cuban Missile Crisis and tax cuts, but Lee Harvey Oswald did what he did, ending Kennedy's term just 2 years in. Lyndon B. Johnson did a fantastic job of weathering the ensuing storm from Kennedy's assassination. He helped advance civil rights movements with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965. He saw the nation through the Vietnam War and declared war on poverty. Richard Nixon was doing an alright job in handling foreign matters with China and the Soviet Union following the Vietnam War, but all that was overshadowed by the Watergate scandal. Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter could be considered as filler presidents, except the latter was responsible for the oil crisis and a couple of war acts in the Middle East we'd rather not talk about. Ronald Reagan, yeah, that's another man of the people. On the outside, he cut down taxes, shrunk the federal budget, increased friendly relations with the Soviet Union, and reduced the size of the government. But for political experts, Reagan's neoconservative approach did more harm than good as it led to increased military spending and an overall massive increase in national debt. George Bush's one noble act after the Persian Gulf War and Operation Desert Storm was signing the Americans with Disabilities Act. Bill Clinton and George W. Bush were quite similar in that they led the nation during the early years of modern technology, but were different in that Clinton was a baby boomer president, loved, perhaps a little too much, by women and minorities, while Bush was the hardhead who didn't think twice before launching attacks in the Middle East following the events of 9/11. As for the first African American president, Barack Obama, his successor and current president, Donald Trump, and the in-betweener, Joe Biden, we'll leave that to each person's political discretion.